So I'd like to welcome Dr. Chris Field now from the Carbon Farm, and you're going to talk about Wind Marley, is that who is it?
Yeah.
Carbon Farm experimental setup.
Yeah, I'll give you, my name's Chris, I'm a lecturer and researcher at Manchester Uni. Together with all these organisations on the bottom of the screen, we've been involved in an Interreg Care Peat project for the last few years, finishes next year, called, an Interreg project called Care Peat. In the UK, that transfers to two pilot sites, one called Little Walden Moss, West Manchester, one called Wind Marley, which we call a carbon farm. UK partners are, principally Manchester Uni and Lancashire Wildlife Trust, who own the land, who've carried out all the groundworks. And of course, Moss, I've got your logo in the bottom right, Sadie, who are a sub-partner of Lancashire Wildlife Trust and have provided the sphagnum for the project. So we've got a project called the Carbon Farm. It got its name a bit by accident, but it sort of worked out quite well and it sort of stuck well. It gained a lot of sort of publicity for us. Originally, it was sort of going to be, we were thinking about we might sort of farm the sphagnum as biomass, which is a form of polyculture, which was sort of alluded to earlier, and we have got some trial sites on. But we ended up sort of being a carbon farm. But the main rationale behind it is an intact bog may be a small sink for carbon, like Fens and Wixall was, as Fred was just showing us then, or a small source of carbon. What we wanted to see was, can we actually turn it into can we enhance that by trying to actively store more carbon? And the way we're doing that is by sort of quite dense planting of sphagnum moss. So rather than sort of the traditional sort of mix of species you might find on a natural bog, can we store a lot more carbon by really focusing that vegetation on sphagnum moss? I don't know if we've got the answers to that yet, to be honest, but this is sort of where we sort of stand at the moment. Okay, a little bit about Care Peat. For those of you who don't know, there's 9 pilot sites around Europe. We've got France, France, Belgium and Holland, a couple of sites in the UK, and 1 or 2 sites in Ireland. And then we recently, they were the original pilot sites, we originally brought on a couple more, one in North Wales and one in Brittany. The overall aim of the project is to sort of reduce carbon emissions and restore the carbon storage capacity of different types of peatland. And then there's 3 broad objectives, or there were originally 3 broad objectives. First one is, can we sort of develop reliable methods to not just to measure the carbon storage, but also to try and model it. That's a real barrier if you're going to undertake restoration, is trying to, monitoring carbon balance is a really expensive and time-consuming process. We've done a lot of work on socio-economic models. One of the outputs of it is an economic model. One of the outputs of the project is an economic model of the carbon farm, and indeed an economic model for each of the sort of pilots. But we've also done a lot of policy work and active engagement with policymakers. And then the third one is sort of trying to share expertise amongst the group and sort of restore collaboratively the different types of peatlands. There's a fourth one. Last year we got some more money out of Europe for a capitalisation project, and that is we brought on a couple of extra sites there, but also it's a lot of farmer engagement as well. We've brought National Farmers Union of England and Wales on as an associate partner on the project, and we recruited a research assistant who started a couple of weeks ago. And in fact, it struck me really when I heard some of the talks this morning that it would have been really useful for her to come and listen to it, because there's been quite a nice sort of diverse range of speakers, and her job is to try and engage quite positively with farmers to understand your sort of perceptions and experiences, and to sort of try and sort of bridge those gaps, because I guess traditionally we're not sort of a group of people who've talked with each other very well. Anyway, right. So that's sort of Care Peat. Just a few pictures of our pilot sites. Ireland, Clucrow Bog is a sort of a drained peatland, actually in quite nice condition really. There's also an extractive peatland from Borden Namona, which has sort of come into the project as well, called Cave Mount, an extractive peatland, Little Walden Moss in the UK. A load of, in Belgium, fen valley meadows that follow the line of this Zwarte Beek or something, the Black Creek. A really picturesque and biodiverse part of the world. We've got drained peatland in France, sort of south of Paris, and also a new one in Brittany. A form of sort of a forested woodland in Wales. And then perhaps, the most interesting site is perhaps in the Netherlands, where we've got sort of terrestrialised former peat pits. So this is where the surface of the peat is risen above the surrounding area, and it's oxidising because the water table, we can't lift the water table here because it's controlled regionally in a sort of, I guess if you've anyone's been to that area of Holland. So in that instance, they've pulped this young woodland that sits on the top and the upper layer of peat and piped it to form a new bit of land within a water body, maybe almost similar to what Fred was sort of alluding to then, to create two areas of peatland that are in a rapidly sort of carbon building stage. I guess the thing that ties all of them together is hydrology, not necessarily re-wetting per se in the Dutch example, but it certainly is control of the water table relative to the landmass. What's been really nice about Care Peat is that there's been a number of knowledge organisations or universities who've worked together and collaboratively with the land organisations, and we've actually managed to sort of monitor greenhouse gases and lots of other sort of environmental parameters at all the pilot sites. So, okay, that's the project in general. So looking at the UK, particularly Winmarleigh Carbon Farm, we're located up in the northwest of England. That's sort of Blackpool there, Manchester, Blackburn, Preston and Lancaster just above. It's the yellow dot here. We're not too far from the coast. It's quite a low-lying part of the world. It's about 4.5–5 metres above sea level. And it's part of a once expansive sort of wetland area called Pillings Moss. We're just sort of sitting right on the edge of that. But a lot of that area is fairly agricultural at the moment. This is what the site was like when we turned up to it. Lancashire Wildlife just bought this site in 2019, which is really timely because we'd sort of put in a project bid saying we were going to do something on a site if we were successful, and we were. And I think it broadly encompasses this sort of area here. It's about the whole area is 20 hectares. The size of the pilot is about 4 hectares. It's what's really nice about the pilot site is it's adjacent to Winmarleigh Moss SSSI. There's also another mossland nearby called Gull Moss, which is in restoration by Lancashire Wildlife Trust. If you look at this picture here, and so we've got the drain pasture here. There's a deep drainage ditch called Crawley's Dyke, which you can sort of see here, and you can also sort of pick out on the OS map here. And this is the sort of the SSSI that sits the other side of that drainage ditch, with a picture in the bottom right. So one of the I guess real sort of objectives we wanted to see from the project was to see if we could, by restoring the adjacent sort of farmland next to the SSSI, can we also improve our water retention on Winmarleigh Moss itself? Because Lancashire Wildlife Trust was struggling to do that, and they had a series of sort of piling down the edge of this sort of channel here. So yeah, it's grazed pasture. It was grazed primarily as sheep, and let's sort of have a look at what we sort of did. So firstly, we did sort of some example sort of soils analysis to understand the sort of status of the farm soil. It was actually fertilised on the day we turned up and took those pictures on the previous page. We took 10 soil cores. pH was also undertaken, and lots of anion and cation analysis. So calcium and magnesium levels were also high, as you might expect from a bit of land that's been lined. You can see here quite clearly that the upper soil profile was quite rich in nitrate, and that's sort of something which came up before. If we compare that to sort of a range of levels which we took when we sort of sampled the surface soil in a survey we did of UK bogs a few years back, then you can sort of see that the levels were sort of clearly elevated and not necessarily conducive to sort of restoration or carbon farming, sphagnum farming, whatever that may be. So pH was also quite elevated in this upper layer as well, as I said, and also calcium and magnesium. So we stripped the topsoil off. I'll tell you more about that in a second, with the objective of reducing the sort of more nutrient poor acid peat underneath, and also to reduce the agricultural seed bank with the hope of promoting sort of sphagnum growth. So we sort of, well, I suppose when you were doing a research project or a pilot site, we had to undertake this in 3 years, and actually it became 4 years because of coronavirus. So in some respects, the pandemic did us a huge favour, because there's no way we would have been finishing off the project last month, because there's still so much more work to be done. We used the topsoil to fill all the drains, and also to create bunds that created our sort of hydrological isolation of the cells. I'll show you in a sec on the pilot site, and also to separate the grazed pasture that was left with the carbon farm. There was also a bit of peat left over, which is and perhaps maybe if we're in the real world, we wouldn't necessarily have stripped the topsoil. Certainly, we would have had to do some to create the bunds and to fill the ditches. I think that perhaps there are other ways of reducing the nutrients on a real farm. Someone mentioned like Phragmites or Typha and stuff. So fast-growing crops that can actually strip out nutrients, and then you reduce the nutrient levels over time, and then you might begin to sort of grow a lower nutrient sort of crop in the future. So this was all done sort of right at the sort of start of lockdown. It did delay us a little bit, and it certainly delayed us in getting on to sort of start some of the measurements. And then towards the end of September 2020, we densely planted 150,000 bean moss sphagnum hummocks, sort of about the size. That's not one hummock, that's sort of a roll of probably about 20 or 30 hummocks. Each hummock's probably about the size of a 50p piece, and there's 5 different sort of species of sphagnum within that hummock. So in a 1 metre square area, they'd be planted every 20 centimetres, so we'd have 25 hummocks in that particular area. So yeah, really dense sort of planting of sphagnum compared to your average restoration project. We also undertook some peat core analysis on the carbon farm and the grazed pasture to understand what sort of level of carbon storage there was as a baseline. I guess if we come back to the project in a few years' time, we can sort of see if we've had any real sort of benefit. There's about 1.5 metres of peat at the site. You can sort of just see this sort of woody layer sort of marking the bottom of it above the glacial clay. It's actually quite nice peat below the surface layer, which is sort of fairly really oxidised. There's sort of quite a lot of sphagnum prevalent in the sort of in the peat history. If we look at the carbon percentage, then there's quite a bit of oxidation in the upper layer. This is as a result of drainage. So the site was drained, I think, in the 1970s. But then also in a second wave of government grants in about 1990, the farmer who LWT bought the land off said to us, so in that time period, that upper layer has lost about 1/5 of its carbon store. It's also actually, it's quite apparent when you're on the site. If you look across to the SSSI, which had sort of fairly light peat extraction until about the mid-70s, the peat there is about 3.5 metres deep. So on the grazed pasture, that sort of 45, 50-year period has led to sort of quite a substantial loss in the depth of the peat through predominantly oxidation. Okay, so yeah, that's the sort of starting point. This is our experimental setup. I better speed up, haven't I? So this is our sort of carbon farm. It's 200 metres in length and 100 metres wide, and there's 8 cells that are 50 by 50 metres each on it. There's a control site, which is the sort of existing grazed pasture, and it's separated by sort of bunds running around the site. We've got a water retention area at the top end of the farm, which feeds water from solar powered pumps, which are operated by ball and cock down sort of two we've sort of split the site down the middle, and we've got these sort of central irrigation ditches that sort of distribute water across the site. The yellow dots represent our greenhouse gas monitoring collars, and then we've also got a weather station on site as well to record environmental variables to enable us to model carbon emissions. Okay, we've got permanent dip wells installed at everywhere we monitor greenhouse gases, but then we also have continuous water table depth loggers located on the grazed pasture and the carbon farm. Our objective is to try and maintain the water level at about 10 centimetres below the surface, which we think is optimised based on Chris Evans and a lot of his colleagues' work to allow oxidation of methane in the upper layer, but also to maximise that reduction of CO2 losses. We've managed to do that with different degrees of success. We've certainly managed to keep the carbon farm wetter than the grazed pasture. So when we have a rainfall event, both wet up really well, but then the grazed pasture drops away because of the effect of the drains. So we do manage to keep the water table higher. We did struggle last year. We've made some alterations to the water retention system and the pumping system since to sort of better manage the water on site. But actually, we didn't have any rain in early 2021 for about 6 or 7 weeks, so we really did struggle on site. Okay, but just to highlight, we do manage to sort of separate the hydrological regimes between the grazed pasture, which is neighbouring to the separate to the carbon farm. So it is possible to do that at a landscape level at a cost, I must admit. Okay, here's sphagnum growth within the collars. So that's as it went in September 2020, and then this is a couple of weeks ago, early on this month, when we did our greenhouse gas measurements. Average sphagnum growth within the collars has gone from that 4.5% to, or cover rather, to 42%. So really, really good cover rate. You can see this is the sort of that plotted monthly. In the early stage of the project, where we had this, where we've struggled with water, is when the sphagnum growth has really stagnated. So it's really important that we get a handle on this sort of water availability to promote maximum sphagnum growth. Okay, onto the carbon measurements. This is a system we use. It's a Los Gatos greenhouse gas analyzer. It measures CO2 and methane sort of continuously. We use a chamber that goes over the plants, and then we've got a bit of an extension collar on there as well when we're sort of monitoring taller plants. But on the sphagnum farm or the carbon farm, we just use this sort of chamber at the top. And then we also record other environmental variables like temperature, water level, light level, photosynthetic reactive radiation when we make a measurement. So net ecosystem exchange is that balance between photosynthesis and respiration. So net ecosystem respiration and gross primary productivity. Apologies, this might hark back to sort of biology lessons at university for you. We measure that if it's in the light, but then we also stick a dark cloth over it, and then that shuts off photosynthesis, so we get net ecosystem respiration. Methane is sort of constant throughout, it's not affected by the light. And then if it's a good day, we also put a net on to give us an intermediary light level, and it allows us to collect a bit more data. Okay, so looking at chamber measurements, right up to about April this year. So we've got net ecosystem exchange. Anything negative is a carbon uptake. Net ecosystem respiration. Anything positive is a carbon loss. Methane didn't really do much actually at the site. These numbers are really, really small, even when expressed as CO2 equivalent. So, you know, a couple of orders of magnitude, or a few orders of magnitude lower than the CO2 fluxes. So, in terms of uptake, well, actually, the pasture, which is in blue, it's grass. It's growing really, really well and really quickly. It's taken on a lot of biomass. Is a real carbon sink during the day. Remember, these measurements are taken during the day. So when we make our measurements between, say, 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, at sort of optimum sort of levels for photosynthesis, and then you've got daylight. I don't know, daylight might occur, say, between 5 a.m. and 10 p.m. In the winter, of course, those daylight hours are a lot lower. So the respiration fluxes, where the grazed pasture is actually losing a lot more carbon than the sphagnum farm, they sort of take over when we model it and add all those up to allow for the night times as well. And I'll give you the results of that modelling on the next slide. What we have found is that the carbon farm is slowly starting to become a carbon sink in the last sort of few months, as that sort of sphagnum growth, or the sphagnum hummocks are beginning to sort of coalesce together. Okay, so to work those up in terms of a budget, based on the establishment year, so we've done the first year from December 2020 to end of November last year. The grazed pasture is losing 24.5 tonnes, or just under CO2 equivalent, so that includes the methane budget as well, per hectare per year. And the carbon farm is losing about 3.5 tonnes. So it was still losing in that first year, when we still had a lot of bare peat in between the little plugs of sphagnum. But just by re-wetting the site and managing the water table, we've managed to sort of knock 20 tonnes out of that loss. So the re-wetting side is really, really important. Okay, so the pasture's drained. It's also still fertilised and cropped by sheep, and also they're creating their own fertiliser. So there's a lot of respiration losses on that site. At the moment, our carbon farm is fairly bare. Well, actually, not so much now. So there's much lower productivity, but we are hoping that we're going to see some positive or negative carbon sink numbers as we achieve sphagnum cover over the next sort of year or so of the project. What I probably didn't highlight on the when we had the picture of the carbon core was the carbon storage, which is about 692 tonnes per hectare. So it's half Wicksalls or Fens and Wicksall, but it's still considerably more than Thorn and Hatfield. But that's reflecting the sort of 1.5 metres of peat that we've got across the site on average. If we look at those losses, that rate of loss of 24.5 tonnes, which is the same as if you take the O2 out of CO2, it's 6.66 tonnes per hectare, then actually that stock will disappear in 104 years. Obviously, at that rate won't probably persist at that level, and actually this year has been much wetter. So our initial modelling that we've sort of not done based on not a complete year's worth of data suggests that the Grace pasture isn't losing that much this year. However, it does highlight long-term sustainability, doesn't it, for sort of farming on this type of peatland. And I think also what it highlights is there's only 1.5 metres of peat there. The site itself is about 4 metres above sea level and not far from the coast. So I think that it does highlight potential increased flooding issues if we sort of don't do something about that and try and sort of stem that loss of, fall in sort of surface levels. Okay, so we're about out of time, aren't I? Okay, so just very quickly then to round us off. Just stripping and re-wetting it, we reduced those CO2 losses in the first year. We're hoping to get a carbon sink in the next sort of year or so, and current data looks fairly promising. The losses are potentially unsustainable. I was going to talk about economic modelling, but I haven't really got time today. And also we're sort of on about the 8th version of our economic model, and I'm getting a bit confused by it because I'm not an economist. So I took out the slide that talked about economic modelling. We had Scott showed some really nice data for farm incomes earlier, and actually if we look at the income the farmer gets from grazing, then selling carbon is a no-brainer economically. The challenge is when we look at productive land use and the crop generation, and I think that's where paludiculture comes in, as the lady at the back raised the point before. And we have got another site that is sphagnum farming with Beda Moss that actually has got the potential income levels to replace crop production, but that's for a different topic. I know we're out of time, but if you permit me, I'll just do a quick flyover from Mike Longdon, who I think was going to be here, from Manchester Wildlife Trust. So this is a SSSI, and this is the carbon farm, and that's the pasture around, just so you can see it in the context of the landscape. So that's the water retention area at the bottom left, looking very wet. This was probably taken earlier in the year. We've got a cover of straw over the when we first planted the sphagnum, and that was to reduce transpiration losses, but also to create a bit of a mulch to protect the sphagnum based on other trials we'd done. This is a problem cell we had in the middle that was very wet. We didn't actually plant up. Well, I'll just pause it there actually. That ceased to become a problem cell now. The whole site was laser level, but as it sort of re-wetted up, that laser leveling has sort of turned out to be quite irrelevant. You can see the sort of it's sort of everything sort of changed levels at different times, but it's not wet it's not the wet area anymore. We've sort of resolved that. Just at the bottom here, we put in a Phragmites trial, and this was to try and remove nutrients from the soil as an alternative to topsoil stripping. We also talked about adding nutrients to part of the site as a bit of a sphagnum farming trial, and we haven't done that. So the Phragmites was also there to try and clean and purify the water before we entered the watercourse. But yeah, that sort of hopefully give you a bit of an idea of the lay of the land. We'll just go back. And then if you get access to these slides after, there's a really nice film for Manchester Wildlife Trust on YouTube. And you can Google LWT Carbon Farm. They've got a nice overview there. I did a short one for some students, so it's very informal, but it's a 360 one, so you can sort of spin around a little bit. And then there was a really nice one done as part of the Care Peat project, where we've sort of got it seems that it's got a close-up of us bringing our squeaky wheelbarrow on with our greenhouse gas analyzer in. If we'd have known it was going to be that much of a close-up, we'd have probably bought a new wheelbarrow when we did the project. But yeah, anyway, that's me. Any questions? Thanks for listening.
really interesting. Just, you missed the slide I wanted to say, which is the economic model. Sorry.
I took that out, it was on the previous version of this, I can talk to you about it.
Because you've created a really interesting research project there, but it's an artificially pumped system, so
Yeah.
that's got an underlying cost to sustain it.
Yeah,
Correct.
I'm just wondering, do the carbon credits or selling bunches of stagnant moss down at the market, do they tot up to cover the costs of managing the farm? It's good to use the word farm.
yeah.
And I suppose to give you a break, Chris, are you going to publish that next year, the economic modelling?
We've got a draft, right, we've done a draft version of it, but my colleague who's an economist who's done it, unfortunately, he can't talk a language which the rest of us sort of understand. And we keep asking him, look, just give us this, we're not sure about profitability, and just give us a break-even point. And sort of, certainly the versions I've seen suggest that if you're just looking at restoration, then actually it could be viable to sell the carbon credits to cover it. The cost of our pilot was really high. You know, we did a pilot in 3 years, as opposed to probably doing something that would take maybe 10 years or longer to try and do. So the pilot cost £75,000 per hectare to deliver. So we can't expect selling carbon even at 20 tonnes of saving times by sort of 30 years. That's what 600 tonnes, whatever market price is for that. The income, there's good income from that, isn't there? But it's not going to cover £75,000. What we do want to do in the next stage of this model, and I think we're almost there. We got another version of it yesterday, is to go and have 2 different validation exercises for that model. The first one of those will be with farmers. So we know a few farmers quite well, and I'm happy to talk to more farmers and sort of, bearing in mind the pilot was delivered with excuse me, a lot of contractor income. Sorry, a lot of contractor services, and quite an expensive irrigation system, that actually a farmer will be using his or her own labour to do that. So that will bring a lot of those costs down. We've also really densely planted sort of sphagnum moss, which is not an inconsiderable cost to try and make it work over a very short period of time. So I think with more sensible costs, it can sort of work. It can certainly work excuse me, as an alternative to grazing. The farmers we spoke to, some of them are, gosh, it's a Theresa May moment, this, isn't it? When they grow actual crops, and we're looking at sort of much, quite high income levels. That might be the last one, I don't know. Then there's a real challenge to try and find an income to replace that. We've got, as part of an Innovate UK project, or we've had a couple of Innovate UK projects with BMOS and other partners. We've got some sphagnum farming trials, which are again on Lancashire Wildlife Trust. One of them is on Lancashire Wildlife Trust land, and we've, over a small area, perhaps an area maybe just a bit bigger than this room, or times that by 2, we've managed to grow sphagnum in really high volumes by a different irrigation method, perhaps by using nutrients as well, which you probably use in farming. And I think the work that Neil's done, Neil Wright from BMOS, as we sort of done initial biomass harvest in that, and that income is looking like something like about £36,000 per hectare. And I think, and I might be speaking out of turn, that was over like a 3-year cycle. Now, whether we managed to achieve that on a larger scale or not, I don't know, because there's a whole other range of problems when it comes to upscaling those. But at that level of income, then that can actually start looking at replacing sort of productive land. And that sphagnum farming is a growing media to replace peat, of which there's going to be a massive demand to replace peat as we move forward over the, especially if we ban peat use in horticulture, which looks like it might happen as well. We have, as part of that, those Innovate projects, conscious of time, we have also worked with end user, like nurse, grow media organisations. So Melcut Industries are a peat-free compost provider, and they've had a lot of trials out in nurseries. And they tell us actually with sphagnum blended into peat-free compost, because sphagnum has all the properties of peat, like it's really good at holding water, doesn't dry out like peat, it's got lots of nutrient exchange sort of capacity, high nutrient exchange capacity within its sort of cells. Then actually the plants grow quite well within sphagnum. So it looks, there's actually quite a ready-made market sort of set up for sphagnum farming as a growing media. We just need to be able to grow it. I think the nursery, the compost provider says if you can grow it, we'll buy it. I think there are you know, there's other polludiculture trials as well out there. The Great Fen Project's got a few examples, if you Google those. It's really in its infancy, though, considering how urgently we need to resolve the situation. There's, you know, the situation's got to be resolved within the next sort of 8 years, hasn't it, or whatever. So, or maybe 10 to 15 at the most, and we're sort of a long way from doing that. We've got to really sort of change the scale at which we do all these things. And also, I think what sort of struck me earlier was we're not very good at telling our story. We don't we don't talk with farmers, and this is part of the reason why we've got this research assistant taken on to try and bridge some of those gaps. You know, we sort of, I realised actually what I thought was really commonplace knowledge in sort of our research fields in terms of polludiculture and stagnant farming and carbon farming. Actually, it's quite a bit of a silo, and we don't really talk about outside ourselves. So I think we need to get a lot better at sort of getting that message out there. Yeah, so I digressed a bit from the original question.
Take one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, just got distracted and forgot what I was going to ask. I mean, yeah, that's right. I don't know if this is a question for yourself or Fred, but I'm really interested. There's an urgency, right, in getting stuff done, and you know, a lot of the alternative crop things are quite far away, I think, in terms of marketability and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if there's research being done to look at where water levels are, for example, on the farm and stuff. So how much carbon can we save by tolerating, you know, a water table that is significantly higher than it is at the moment, but is still able to give us a grassland crop, for example, or something like that? Is there work?
I think so, but I think that's also in its infancy. Maybe Fred will also might want to answer afterwards. We've certainly noticed that on our carbon farm. Actually, we've said, well, you know, if we can get most of this benefit just by bringing the water table up, and in fact, this year's wetter than last year, and we've already noticed that, you know, the animals were struggling last year on the farm because there wasn't really enough grass to feed them. But this year it's a lot wetter. The carbon losses aren't quite as high, and yeah, there's already a carbon saving there, but it's still very viable as a grazing sort of solution. I think the farmers we're working with who sort of graze the site have sort of said, actually, we could look at moving to maybe higher value, rarer breed crop animals that might fare well in this situation. There was a nice article in The Guardian from Lancashire Wildlife Trust, I think last week. They've got a wetter farming experiment on a place called Vindles Moss, west of Manchester, which is in collaboration with Liverpool John Moores Uni. So that's a former potato field where it's got a varying water table, so they're trialling different crops at different water tables to see what's viable. Probably not for root crops, but there's a farmer we've spoken to, done a bit of work with in the northwest who grows celery, and celery quite likes it a bit wetter. So yeah, there's a few different sort of potential crops out there. And you're right, there might be a way that we can certainly mitigate some emissions in the short term by modifying things. But I don't know if there's anything out there that's saying, yes, we've done this, here's this case. Everything's at a similar sort of stage, but I don't know if Fred wanted to add anything to that.
Well, actually, Chris, you mentioned the exact same number I was going to have, which is the 10 centimetres. So the Nature report last year basically said, yes, if you raise the water table to about that, you could still have agriculture, but you would also have the cut in the greenhouse gases. So cut rather than necessarily sick, but cut. Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I mean, I think the published reports I know of basically said what you said in your talk. Yeah.
Okay.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think we'll move to the next thought. Thank you so much.
Okay, no worries. Cheers.